Dr. Bhaskar, Assistant Professor, Department of Computer Science and Engineering, Anna University, Chennai. Area of specialization is software engineering and database system. Guided more than 12 research scholars, published more than 40 national and international papers. Is a reviewer and editorial board member in international journals.
Welcome to UGC lecture series in computer science. In this series of lectures, we have been looking at a subject called software engineering, and for today's session we will be talking the continuation of capability maturity model. As we have looked in the previous session about the different levels that a capability maturity model would take, starting from initial stage, which is level 1, till the optimized stage, between which we have managed, defined and quantitatively managed and optimized. Let us look at as a form of a table with reference to the project characteristics and behavior. As an initial stage, the process is unpredictable. It will be poorly controlled and it will be reactive. Why at level 1 it is unpredictable is primarily because we are not doing a waterfall model at all the stages. So, the processes are not clearly being defined. So, it becomes unpredictable and it is not controllable also and will be purely reactive. It will not be proactive, it will be reactive. It is all happening because that we have not defined clearly what are our requirements. So, our major focus is on firefighting mode, where the possibility of risk will be heavier. So, at that particular juncture we will go for a firefighting mode. So, the effectiveness of the project will be low and the frustration will be high. Whereas, when we shift to a managed process, some of the characteristics of the second level of managed behave something like this. A process is characterized for projects and is often reactive. Over reliance on experience of good people, when they go, the process goes. So, it is something that if I give a project to an experienced hand, they might clearly picture out what are the kinds of requirements that this project might require. So, experience plays a predominant role here, which actually behaves like a heroic. The third level, which is seeming to be a defined level, where the process is characterized for the organization and is proactive. It is for the organization and is proactive. So far in the first two levels it has been reactive. Now that it becomes proactive because all the requirements at this stage are clearly been defined. So, the reliance will be on the defined processes. People can understand what is expected on the software and how the software will behave under different circumstances. They will support for the project and follow the processes. Quantitatively managed, this being the level 4, process is measured and is being controlled. To understand the effectiveness of the project, we may have to measure the project on different conditions. So, on level 4 we will be quantitatively managing it, manage the entire project. So, we have a measuring parameter and we take this process into a controlled manner, where a greater sense of the team and interdependencies would be there. Say for example, one team might be working on this module of a project, the other team might be working on some other module of a project. There needs an interdependency between these two modules. So, a teamwork along with interdependency plays a vital role so as to measure and control this kind of an environment. Level 5 talks about optimizing, where again maturity plays a predominant role. So, the focus is on continuous quantitative improvement. Whatever that we have measured, if it has not achieved the success level, that is efficiency level, then we might talk about improving on the accuracy or the efficiency of the work. For these cases, we have gone for another term which is called Six Sigma, which introduces or minimizes the number of defect ratio on a given project. So, on level 5, we will be concentrating on the continuous quantitative improvement of the software projects. So, the focus again is on fire prevention. We started initially with firefighting. Now that we are talking about fire prevention at level 5, which concentrates on improvement anticipated and desired and the impacts being assessed. So, what are the impacts of these kind of a work? If at all it is to be predicted as an error, and when it rolls out to the hands of the customer, if it has been predicted as a defect, what are the impacts of these defects when it has been rolled out, will be discussed as level 5. So, at level 5, our concentration is mainly on optimization of the entire workflow process. So, here again, as I have introduced with one specific word as Six Sigma, which talks about the defect ratio calculation and the prevention. It is not the product which has been proved 99% defect free. It is about talking about you cannot produce 100% defect free software, but then as a over reliance you can say that my product is 99% defect free, and on top of it Six Sigma enhances or it takes you through 99.99% defect free environment. So, by appliance of Six Sigma practices, it becomes mandatory that you adopt to 0.99% more than the 99% that is already been proved. Here again I will try to impose with two other important techniques which are called team software process and personal software process. As a team, when it is to behave in an organization, how would we work? So, we have certain process areas where again an individuals need to concentrate and again a person need to concentrate as a team. So, all these are covered under an umbrella like activities where the umbrella stands for the entire organization's process, and the holding between the umbrella and the cover is for the personal software process. Now, we will look at the components of the capability maturity model. Within each of the 5 maturity levels, there are basic functions that need to be performed. As I have already indicated, there are certain process areas which need to talk to enhance the quantity or the quality of the product. So, these are called process areas. For maturity level 2, as we know, maturity level 2 talks about managed. There are 7 process areas that must be completely satisfied, whereas for maturity level 3 there are 11 process areas that must be completely satisfied. So, likewise, when I am to pass through a certain level in my capability maturity model, level 1 requires basic process areas to be processed, level 2 requires 7 process areas to be processed, and level 3 requires 11 of its process kind to get to the next stage. Given the interactions and overlap, it becomes more efficient to work the maturity level 2 and 3 issues concurrently. So, when there seems to be more kind of an interaction between the developers and the customers, when they interact more, so they get to know about what is to be developed and the requirements can be easily gathered. In such a case, these level 2 and level 3 can be concurrently processed, parallelly processed. Within each process areas, there are limited set of goals or a defined set of goals to be achieved, and within each goal there are certain practices that are involved. Understand, this capability maturity model is not a new technology or not a new technique being utilized. Instead, these has got certain goals which are to be achieved at each and every level. So, if suppose I am to achieve some level of goals at or some process areas which are to be achieved at level 1, those frame a part of goal 1. So, within each process area there are goals to be achieved, and within each goal there are certain practices. Certain industries would work on some of the best practices which later point of stage will turn towards the goal of a company. Practices, work products, etc. to be followed that will support each of the goals. The basic terminology of CMMI and its entire structure, as I have already indicated, maturity models vary from level 1 to level 5, but then these level has to solve all the practices of process areas which has been characterized starting from 1 to n. So, these become the next layer becomes the process area 1 to n. Required specific for each process area are defined with specific goals and generic goals. So, every process area is being distinguished under two different classes. One class is called a specific goal, where for a certain set of project we may have to define with specific goals. For a reservation system, a reservation management system, my goals are clearly defined, whereas there are generic systems which might adopt with only generic goals. So, those are required and are being common across all the process areas, whereas the specific goals are specific for each process area. When you consider generic goals, there are certain common features that are involved within the generic goals, which are to commitment to perform, ability to perform, directing implementation and verifying implementation. Apart from talking about all these level 5 status in terms of the process area, it is in turn dependent on the person's ability to capture to all the performance areas or the practices so as to achieve the goal. So, I should have a basic set of commitment so that I can perform to that particular level, or I should have the availability and the ability to perform to those levels, and I will be directing all these implementations, verifying the implementation. So, within specific goals, as I have already indicated, these goals will have their own set of practices, whereas generic goals again has their own set of generic practices. These specific goals are required for every process area that I have already mentioned, with an information saying sub practices, typical work products, discipline amplifications, generic practice elaborations, goal and practice titles, goal and practice notes and references. So, these are some of the essential requirements that are required to process in an informative form to a specific practices. So, as a specific area, it is mandatory that I need discipline amplifications, generic practice elaborations, wherein I have to elaborate if in case if my product behaves at least for this level, how in case it is to be enhanced so that it becomes generic. So, the goals and the practice titles, goals and practice notes and references are to be complete. Now, we will have a short break. Welcome back after the break. Before the break, I was discussing about the CMMI terminology and its entire structure, where I have been talking about specific practices and generic practices. Specific practices concentrate on how exactly I have to achieve on the goal and what kind of practices that I may have to adopt, where are my reference materials. similar to a generic practices, where again I will be talking about sub practices, typical work products, discipline amplifications, generic practice elaboration, goal and practice titles, goals and practice notes and references, which are very common to both the specific and generic practices. These makes every project informative, and these are being transformed across specific and generic platforms. As an example to this capability maturity model, let us consider for the requirements management process area, an example goal that is required for the requirements process area are, say I am to manage the entire requirements. An example practice to support the goal required is maintain bidirectional traceability of requirements. Say for example, when I ask to retrieve a student record about which is to mention the entire student detail, in that specific case it becomes bidirectional. Whereas, when I am posting some record onto the database, it becomes unidirectional. So, my customer would give me a specification wherein they will mention these are certain circumstances where I might have to store all this data, and these are certain circumstances wherein I have to retrieve all this data. So, these two are all about manageability. So, my goal entirely talks about managing those requirements, whereas my practices talk about maintaining the bidirectional traceability of the requirements. Some of the examples suggested but not required of a typical work product might be, I might go for a traceability matrix wherein I will mention saying here is where I stand. I trace specifically mentioning that my requirement stands somewhere here, my requirement is plotted somewhere here. So, here is where I stand, as a next stage I might have to proceed from here. So, my work product typically lies on requirements traceability matrix or requirement tracking system. For certain matured processes, I might not produce with both of these things, say requirements traceability matrix or a requirement tracking matrix is not mandatory. So, I repeat, a goal is all about managing the requirements, whereas the practice is nothing but maintaining bidirectional traceability of requirements, and work products are nothing but requirements traceability matrix or requirements tracking system. So, most of the time these work products are not mandatory, whereas to any specific projects goals and practices are being mandatory. So, our observation with regard to whatever we have looked at so far, CMM contains a lot of verbiage and it can seem like just a word game, which it might be to some extent. So, we have introduced with certain words like initial, defined, optimized, managed, quantitatively managed, and all these phases, and all these things initially might look like a verb, but then it is not a word game at all, wherein we are defined with certain process areas. Every process area has its own definitions. If you get beyond the verbiage, however, CMM does describe some important methods for running software projects. Some of the major problems that we come across as we go along this CMM are, it is a goal and not a method, being used just as a stamp of approval, just to get to understand what is the maturity process that we typically follow in a firm, in an organization. Where do we stand? Where, that is what we are supposed to understand. So, it is more about achieving the goal and not about a method, and it does not say anything about the software. It isn't specific to this kind of a software or this kind of a product. So, it isn't mandatory that software processes typically has to go through CMMI phases, and it does not help in crisis at all, only for repetitive tasks. Anything that takes up a repeated set of activity so that they get to understand what my process areas are, and that is where we get ourselves matured in terms of software development. Since we talk more about software, I am talking in terms of software development. As I have already indicated, CMM is a goal and it is not a method, where organizations often look to CMM as a method or a formula for improvement. Any individual, we might say them that there is always been a scope for improvement. A scope for improvement in turn means if I am to do a repetitive task, next time when I do a certain same set of tasks, then whatever that I have been doing as an error in the previous stage, those can be neglected at the next phase. So, tempting to want easy answers subsequently when I follow with the answers. CMM is actually a management framework with many details left out. Say for an example, you must have peer reviews, but how should the reviews be run? So, although it projects with a specific process area wherein we indicate saying there should be peer reviews, but again I should frame out a list of parameters. How should these peer reviews been applied? And if you say we do CMM just like the book, you aren't doing CMM at all. So, we cannot consider those process areas as given in the book. Say for example, level 2 comes across 7 process areas and level 3 comes across 11 process areas. If those are being adopted as such as it is given in the best practices book, then we are not following CMM at all. It might be any standards or any process areas that can also be redefined, but that should come under only these 5 levels. So, to use CMM, you have to think, you must be flexible and you might have to be creative and integrate the goals of CMM with the realities of your business. That is why, because of these probable reasons, it tends us to go to an agility model, ad hoc model, agility based model, where we go in for agile practices. We tend to be more flexible, not in terms of the standard A, D, C, T flows. Something that is related to this point, some organizations are rigid about mandating CMM to their employees. So, if at all a firm which tries to employ more at the preliminary level, so they may have to understand what exactly is CMM supposed to do, so that they will take up those responsibilities and attain the goal which as desired by the organization. So, they have to build up from the initial and their maturity level has to go up, so that their goals are clearly been achieved after some point in time. So, this has given CMM a bad reputation as an onerous, inflexible method. So, do not make CMM as a mandate to all the organizations, whereas it might take you to a bad reputation. The problem here usually is misunderstanding CMM and not its rigidity. Another major drawback that I have pointed out as a part of CMM was it has been becoming a stamp of approval. Once it has cleared level 4, then it means the product has gained so much of maturity and it is a valuable product in the market. So, that is not the way which we produce CMM to be. Some organizations want CMM only as a stamp of approval, without a high level commitment to process improvement or quality, and want to find easiest ways to get certified as level 2 or level 3 without really being changing. After having understood level 1 to 5, companies are to assess where do they stand, and it is not a certifying authority mentioning that we stand at level 3 or level 4 or level 5, wherein we might produce so much of mature projects. So, I talked to the first CMM assessor in the world. She was tired and disillusioned. The reason being, she wanted companies to say, let us work together to improve our software process. Instead, they say just tell us what to do to get level 2. Most of the times, as students, they might ask at the last moment, students who are preparing towards examination, they might ask us, just tell me some of the key points so that I might pass in the examination. It is not such a kind of an environment we try to project for a software. Any companies need to be rated based on the maturity of the process, maturity of the people who are involved to develop the process, and not really on the points that has been gathered over the years. So, instead you cannot ask a question of just tell us what to do to reach level 2 so that we can get back to work. So, this is not the way level 2 or CMM is talking about. It is talking about let us work together to improve our software process. So, it is talking more on a continuous improvement process and not towards on how to achieve this goal or what all the points that you want me to make up so that I will go for that particular level. The other point which CMM talks about is it is not particularly on a software alone. So, CMM is by design a model for managing the software projects, need not be software, it can be other projects also. So, they claim most software failures are due to management problems rather than technical barriers. So, as you might appreciate and agree that software failures majorly it is on the management. People does not understand how to manage given a basic task or given a big problem. Instead, they are very comfortable with the technical. Say they can code, but when it comes to integration, how to integrate, how to actually manage this particular scenario, how to avoid these risk factors, how to improvise on the given set of constraints and limitations. But CMM goes too far in this particular direction. An organization could write loosey code that is consistently and be rated highly by the CMM. This is a counter initiative since good code is a goal for good software development. This CMM in turn does not help us in the period of crisis. So, when we work on a period of crisis where we will not look for a continuous qualitative improvement, we will try to complete the project as much as possible. So, CMM does not help the projects that are in crisis right now. It tries to apply it, then make changes to the things worse. Unfortunately, this is often when companies look for help with their software processes. An analogy for this particular event of how this CMM does not help during the point of crisis. Say for example, for a long term cardiac health patient, when he eats a lot of fruits and veggies and he is trying to quit smoking and gets exercise and reduce stress, this take a maturity level wherein the patient has to understand what is supposed to be done. And it is not that when I take up level 1, I might avoid this kind of a cardiac level, and level 2 I will avoid all these things. So, this is the simple analogy which will try to correlate between a CMM and a regular world environment. But suppose you are having a heart attack now, will these actions help? After having passed through this particular heart attack, we will not starting from level 1. Instead, we will go directly for the higher set of treatment, whether he has to be replaced with the new pacemaker to make the heart functioning again. So, it is too late for preventive measures, you need some other kind of intervention here. So, that is what is a basic comparison what we wanted to project. Say CMM does not work at the crisis level, instead CMM works when it is the entire process is on the continuous improvement phase. CMM is only for repetitive tasks, where CMM is based on reusing past results for the future software projects, but this only makes sense for relatively repetitive projects, say Microsoft Word team creating version 7 after version 1.6. And to create brand new softwares of unknown size with unknown hurdles using human creativity, CMM is clearly not the right model. Summary. So, in this particular session, we have looked at CMM. We have initially started with CMM explaining different levels. Then CMMI continuously addressed on continuous process improvement, and it concentrated on goals, practices and work products, and it has not been a method. So, some of the questions for this particular session being, how are goals of CMM managed? Can CMM work under crucial stages of project development? Mention some drawbacks of CMM. Thank you.